Eric, thanks so very much for joining us today. And I'm sorry to hear you're a little bit under the weather.
Well, thanks for having me get out. Afternoon, Vago. I'd never miss an opportunity to chat with you.
It's always an honor and pleasure, and thanks to David and his whole team for putting this conference together. You and I have spoken for a long time, and I think there's no place probably better to start than the budget outlook. The administration and the House Speaker and the Majority Leader now have a deal, $886 billion. On the defense side, I think it's about 740 some odd billion for the rest of government. We will need a short-term continuing resolution to get us over the finish line as everybody works these details out, even though I think there are some people who are surprised that that much mechanics would be needed at this point. What does it tell you about what the shape of not just government spending, but defense spending is going to be, and what kind of outlook you see for the association and for the aerospace and defense sector?
Well, a couple things to start. Just a reminder to everybody that we seem to treat getting a continuing resolution like a victory, but in many ways it's the worst, least outcome of not having a budget on time in the first place, which we fail to have year after year after year after year, and that's incredibly disruptive to government planners, and to the industries that are trying to help them, not just aerospace and defense. So I want to remind everybody of that the best outcome would be already to have a 2024 budget. And then in the context, the sort of span of CR options, there is worse to much worse, really. So something short at the very beginning, we're all used to dealing with that. But in many ways, having to have dealt with that for year after year after year means you're losing your first quarter as a real strategic planning vehicle, and not trying to get new starts going, not trying to let new contracts. And so we're already in a sort of kind of a permanent disruptive phase based on this planning. Now we find ourselves in a year with additional variables. Somehow they find a way to make it more complicated year after year after year. So separating the vehicles into two deadlines, interesting strategy, but of course further complicates things. And then we have the supplemental out there. And there's a lot in the supplemental that's important, particularly on the defense side. And so it's really hard to do the math and figure out where we're going to actually land on how much money is in the budget for national security. But a reminder for aerospace and defense, there are things in both of the deadlines that are important to us, primarily the second one. But there are a lot of important things for commercial aviation and space in other bills, not just the defense bill. And I would argue a number of things that are important to national security as well, that support national security, for example, NOAA.
And what are some of those things that you would prioritize, right? What are the most important things, if you were going to highlight for lawmakers what it is they need to bear in mind? You're a former authorizer, yourself. What are some of the things that, what are the most important priorities in each one of these segments that people ought to be bearing in mind?
Well, first of all, we absolutely have to get this cleaned up by April so we don't get into those automatic spending cuts. A number of people refer to that as, sequestration 2.0. I don't really like the word sequestration because I don't think most of the country understood it. The story is really not about the cut, which is 1%, because I think most households in the United States, most Americans would think, well, I can absorb that in my household. In fact, I have to often. But when you do automatic cuts and you do them late into the budget year, you really can't do a peanut butter spread across the entire budget, because there are things that are walled off, things you can't cut quickly. And in fact, some things are increasing. For example, pay for uniformed military and civilians. And so what we saw 10 years ago when we had sequestration, what we called sequestration, is really massive cuts to some parts of the modernization budget and to your O&M, your operations and maintenance, which hit readiness. We're still digging out of the readiness hole that we created for ourselves, because once you stop doing certain things on the readiness side, on the operations side, it's a long time to catch up. And that's also true with modernization, because you're creating this start and stop environment for industry, which is very hard to plan around. So first of all, we want to avoid getting to the spending cuts. But just a reminder also to people that there's a hyper focus on China as a pacing threat. It's bipartisan, it's bicameral. In some ways, it feels like people are tripping over themselves to show that they're tougher on China from a national security perspective. The Pentagon, and it takes a long time to adjust that Pentagon budget based on the budgeting process. The Pentagon was making some noticeable changes, some new starts in 2024 that they can't start because they're still operating under a 2023 budget. So we've got to get we've got to get the CR. There's no way we're going to wrap this up by the coming deadline. But hopefully they can quickly get us to the rest of the year, full year spending bill, so we can get back to some normalcy and start some of these 2024 initiatives, because people don't remember this. Even people on Hill don't necessarily understand this. It feels like Groundhog Day to explain these things every year. A continuing resolution, in effect, keeps money flowing, but it doesn't really account for inflation, first of all, and it keeps the money flowing at the last year's budget rates. So if you have a new start, it
Right.
has to be specifically called out.
I would point out, right, Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall, one of your former colleagues and somebody you still work with closely, points out he doesn't have an innovation problem, he has a money problem. And unfortunately, he hasn't had a steady stream of money to launch some of the initiatives that he wanted to get launched as part of his drive to better prepare the force to continue deterring China. Let me just ask you a brief
It's
supplemental
That's a
question.
perfect.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's a perfect example for the Secretary of the Air Force to do that. He has to tear into the first budget he receives. He's got to work things through the Office of the Secretary of Defense, through OMB. He has to have negotiations with the Hill because he has to find money someplace in the budget to move it. And that's one of the hardest aspects of making changes in the budget is convincing people to give up things, either programs or platforms, to move it in a different direction. So it took him a while to line all that up. And where he first was able to get things done is in the 2024 budget. Now those things are all on hold.
Let me ask you quick. I want to get to the PPB cycle, a very exciting topic for anybody in Washington, and you were one of the commissioners on that. But just a quick Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan supplemental, right? The administration is asking for a pretty hefty chunk of money. Roughly 65 billion of that would be going to Ukraine. The administration makes the point that 90% of that money stays in the United States to buy systems. And we're looking at that spending to be key in how we prepare some of our other capabilities that we need for China. How confident are you that we're going to see that as the speaker, has made this commitment that, look, we're going to get this money and we're going to try to do this. It's existential for the Ukrainians. How important is it that that happens? And what's the impact? What's the way to look at that when it comes to the U.S. defense industrial base?
Well, it is important to point out how we started. Russia invades Ukraine. We start surging munitions and other equipment to Ukraine. And we realized a couple of things right away. First of all, our warehouses weren't full. We had taken little bits of risk year after year after year on purchasing things like munitions, because you can purchase 80% of your target budget on munitions. You can't purchase 80% of a ship. You might
Right.
try, but you can't do it. And so munitions was a place where the Pentagon took risk over many years, over many administrations. I was a part of it. The consequence of that also then is the industrial base shapes itself around that consistent demand signal over the years. So not only were warehouses not full, but when we tried to surge, we didn't have the people, we didn't have the factories, we didn't have the supply chains lined up because we hadn't tried to do that for years. So this supplemental is not just about the geopolitics of supporting those three countries and the debates that we should have on that. It's also about supporting the industrial base and getting our supplies back to where they need to be. So the supplemental money, yes, most of it stays in the United States in order to refill our own warehouses, our own supplies, and it allows us to modernize at the same time and support and build up that industrial base that we now realize needs to retain some type of surge capacity. That capacity itself is a capability that we sort of lost focus on until this invasion of Ukraine. So I
And I want to
think
get to.
in terms
Oh,
of
go
my
ahead.
list where I'm optimistic and pessimistic, I'm a perpetually disappointed optimist. Although I think Washington's finally beating that out of me. But I am worried about the supplemental. It is not just about continuing to support Ukraine. It has the Middle East in it. It has Taiwan in it. But it also is an important aspect for our own security and shoring up our industrial base. So I would, I'm afraid that could be a victim of all of this. There is bipartisan support for it. I think if you just put it on the floor of the House and the Senate wide open, it would win pretty resoundingly. But it's getting caught up in the sort of narrow margins of the Hill right now and how things have been operating for years.
One of these days, we always, it's funny that, my career has spanned more than 3 decades now, as has yours. And actually, we've been in a period of budgetary abnormality more than we've been in budgetary normalcy, which is just incredible. Let me take you to the PPBE. For anybody who's not paying attention, it's the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution process. It dates to the Kennedy administration, really, in many respects, and certainly the Johnson administration. You were part of the commission working to reform that. A lot of buy-in from the department. Bob Hale doing a terrific job chairing that. Ellen Lord and many others also involved in it. The interim findings were out last year. The final report comes out this year. How is this materially going to change how we plan, Eric? Because time and again, we find that some of these organizational, bureaucratic, and mechanical processes are what actually keep us from moving as quickly and actually deploying money at the speed we need to deploy it and with the effectiveness we need to deploy it.
So just on the timeline, the final report comes out in March. We're going over the final text right now. It is a really amazing set of commissioners, many, if not all of whom have worked together for years, both sides of the aisle. A lot of expertise there. A lot of people who feel they've been victims of the PPP system over the years. But I want to start by saying there's a lot of good in that system. It brings everyone to the table. It forces real conversations where tough issues are put up against each other. Everyone has an opportunity, in fact, has to really contribute and make sure that the building and the planners account for out-year expenses, that it's not just 12-month budgets one after another, that if you're going to buy something or maintain something, you've built the tail into the budget, you're showing your homework. I worked with someone from the Department of Veterans Affairs who said, he came over to DOD, you may not like this system, but at least you have a system. But we do recognize that it is not agile enough to keep pace with how fast and how iteratively technology is developed and fielded these days. And so strong interest on the Hill to do something about this, to be supportive of change. I speak today as a commissioner, not for the commission. We'll do that when the report comes out. But the Hill asked us to do a lot of things in this commission. So there are a lot of elements to this that we're reviewing. But for me, I started like a lot of experienced Pentagon people thinking, let's give the building more agility. And then very early on, an appropriator said to me, well, let's not do that just to allow the Pentagon to be more feckless in its planning. And then, of course, we realized Congress has a job to do. We're a congressional commission, actually, a congressional advisory commission. So I don't expect they're looking for us to come back and just point fingers at what Congress can do differently. So to me, it's the three elements. The building needs more agility. A. B, it needs to be tied more clearly and directly to the strategy, which is a part of what we're looking at to make sure that the planning process really links to the strategy. And if you look at the timelines of recent years, the strategy tends to come out after the planning has started. And then third, the Pentagon, the Department of Defense has to do all those important back office things, which are not interesting to a lot of people, but are a critical part of this. So they can account for what they're doing and how they're spending money better and more quickly and more iteratively. So if Congress does grant some agility, and a big part of the Pentagon budget can go through a slower, more thoughtful process. So, it's a part of it. But if Congress gives the Pentagon more flexibility with the tools that it has for certain parts of the budget, it should expect in return that it will be able to monitor that more closely. So we want this report not just to help the Pentagon move faster with the private sector, with technology that's coming out of industry writ large. We want this report to also have ideas. It will have ideas to make Congress's job easier.
And it's great to see that Congress saw the need for change, and in fact, Deputy Defense Secretary Kath Hicks has been working with you guys to adopt many of these processes. So it's not like one of these things where you guys are proposing a whole bunch of things that are actually going to go aren't going to go anywhere.
We had
Let me.
endless numbers of interactions at all levels, inside and outside of government, Department of Defense, the Hill. Recognizing change needs to take place, but we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. There's a lot in the process that helps decision makers make
Right.
good decisions.
I love your line that there are two kinds of people: people who visit PPBE on other people, and those who have had it visited upon them. Exactly, there are great elements and foundational elements of that. Let me take you to the defense industrial strategy, because I do want to get to supply chain, which is something critically important. And time and again, on virtually every new weapon we're trying to produce, it's 3 years by the time we can get there, even with accelerated planning. Obviously, we have to make design modifications, facilitization, and get people in place. Last week, Dr. Laura Taylor Calais, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Industrial Base Policy at the Department, rolled out the nation's first ever explicit defense industrial strategy. I know you and your team have been consulting on it, as many industry leaders have been. Some people say they're a little bit underwhelmed, or rather they say it's a great diagnosis of the problem. But the question is the implication, and we know there's a highly classified annex that goes with this, so it might not be that readily apparent what the key drivers and needle movers on this are. From your standpoint, looking at this as the head of A.I.A, how is this meaningfully going to change planning, budgeting, investment, management of an industrial base, a national security industrial base that broadly includes commercial industry as well, which the document works to try to do, right? It gets out of that defense purely defense hothouse.
Well, I'm encouraged. We still are early in the process because really the details matter about how to get at these problems. I think it's a good diagnosis. And I think Laura Taylor Calais and her team have been great at engagement. They have been making the rounds to industry in the broadest way possible, not just with A.I.A, to really kind of understand everyone's perspective on this. And it builds on some important things in this area done in the previous administration too. So I think there's a realization, we used to shy away from industrial-based policy, and it wasn't always something the Pentagon was very good at, sort of fits and starts historically. But we have a little momentum here. But we'll see, now that we've diagnosed some problems, what we're going to do about them. Because I worry that that team, the industrial-based policy team in the Pentagon, won't necessarily be supported with resources. In the end game, to fix these problems costs money somewhere. And in the end game, sometimes investing in industrial-based policy doesn't compete well against other things that you might want, because you're really talking about investing in a possibility, something that's notional, some capacity that you just want to protect in case you need it, versus something you can actually park out on the ramp or send out to sea. So we'll watch that, because what can happen sometimes in the absence of resources, government will then put the requirements on the industry side, and the burden sharing ratio gets out of kilter a little bit. But ultimately that costs the government money too, because as you put more requirements on industry, that costs money. And so we'll see what happens here, but I'm encouraged by a couple of things. I think it is a collaborative, collegial approach, recognizing that government and industry it's an incredibly important partnership, and it is a competitive advantage for us over China. The Chinese government may have more levers to control, but I think our system moves resource innovation and fosters innovation much better than the Chinese government system. And so we should recognize it as a partnership. Second, it recognizes that we got here after years and years and years of decisions about how we invest, and also years and years and years of budget instability, which is bigger than the Department of Defense. And so I'm encouraged that we're in a good place to have conversations about realistically how we can get at some of these issues and have a strengthened industrial base that not only has more capacity now, but has the ability, the capacity for more capacity when we need to tap into it.
Let me take you to supply chains. As I mentioned, almost everything that we're trying to produce, even with increased investment dollars, is running 3 years behind. Right? It's a little bit like quantum computing, right? The joke was it was always 5 years away. Now almost everything is 3 years away, even if it's a priority item. How the industry has been investing in its supply chain, which is a supply chain of supply chains, right? Each and every single element of this has its own supply chain. Are we making any progress? And how do we need to be thinking about this, right? I mean, because a concern industry has, again, when it comes to defense industrial strategy is if you spend it, we will invest as long as there's going to be sustained demand. We don't want to make millions of artillery shells in 2 years and then never produce another artillery shell for another decade, right? And we're even seeing that in the proposed budget, despite all the talk about the importance of having submarines in that budget, we may not have as many submarines in that budget as folks have said they want. Where are we on this? Is there the stewardship? Are we making the progress we need to be? And if not, what do we need to be doing, Eric?
Well, first, we had years on the defense side, on the non-defense side of the customer, in the case of defense, the Department of Defense, the U.S. government, really trying to drive down cost, which makes a lot of sense. But when you spend years really prioritizing that, industry will respond and will build its, on the defense side. What's interesting is you kind of have this enormous industry with a single customer, and it shapes the contours of the industry that supports it. I think of it as a simple analogy of the Department of Defense treating industry like a hardware store. That they buy something, and then 20 years later, if they want another one, they walk around the corner and they just pick one up. Well, my local hardware store has thousands and thousands and thousands of customers and a network of millions and millions of customers, which levels out that demand. If the Department of Defense doesn't buy a hammer for 20 years, there's no way to make a hammer. The factory shut down, the workforce is moved someplace else, the supply chain is let go. And so that's something that's important to think about. And you mentioned shipbuilding. One of the shipbuilding CEOs I worked with talked about something in the Navy called the slash chart, which I was probably responsible for at one point in my life, which is a one-page PowerPoint slide that shows, how many different types of ships they're going to buy year over year and how the budget in 1 year has changed from the last one. So you may slash your destroyers from 3 to 2 in 1 year. Shipyards can't change and adjust like that in a year's time. And so there has to be some consistency there, considering what it is industry has to put together in order to deliver. And then you mentioned something important. So Russia invades Ukraine. Why can't we ramp up overnight? We have to point out it was years and years and years of decisions that were made that created the industrial base that makes munitions that couldn't surge. Then, okay, we're going to give you some money so you can surge next year because we're at war right now. That's not good for industry either. If you want industry to invest its money, and by the way, there's a lot of private investment that supports the defense industry and that works to our advantage. It's something the department can leverage. And so we want to incentivize that. And by the way, the defense industrial policy report that came out recognizes the value of private investment in this ecosystem. If you really want to marshal that, mobilize that, at a profit rate that's lower than what you see in technology, for example, they have to know that there's going to be some sustained and stable demand signal that they can build to. This up and down thing is very hard to plan for and makes it harder for these companies to attract the type of investment that they need in order to do the things the department wants.
We have about a minute left, and I want to get your take on the hangover from COVID. Some of the smartest analysts I know. I know you can't talk about anything specific, especially with a member company as important as Boeing and the challenges they're having now. But there is a sense among analysts that the reason we're in this problem is, you know, generational pandemic, crash in passenger air travel, no pun intended, sharp decline, and then folks stopped building airplanes because people didn't need airplanes. There was a great retirement. And now, as we are getting back out of it, we're finding supply chain problems across the entire ecosystem. We're finding there aren't as many of the folks we need. And even on the commercial air travel system, the FAA is struggling with a lot of near misses as the system has come back to 2019 demand. From your standpoint, how long is it going to take? How much of this is an aftermath of COVID? How reasonable do we have to be that it's actually going to take some time to dig our way through this? And do we need any different approaches to try to help get back to where we need to be overall
So,
for the production ecosystem, the air travel ecosystem, et cetera?
well, I'd start by saying how important safety is to the entire ecosystem. And I was reading something from James Fallows last week, who's a pilot himself, saying that the aviation safety that you find in the United States, in Europe, is a modern technological marvel, and that even today, it's the safest form of transportation by far there is. He says it's safer to fly than to take a walk or sit in a chair. Statistically, which is a
Yeah.
remarkable thing to think about when we have this conversation. The impact of COVID, it's impossible to overstate what that did to the commercial airline industry, both the manufacturers, the airlines themselves, everything ground to a halt, cash flow ground to a halt. Really hard decisions had to be made very quickly that do take a while to get out of. Workforce decisions, supply chain decisions. But it wasn't just COVID. Again, we don't find ourselves into places quickly. Usually, there's years of decisions that are made, and I don't think there's any one thing that I'd point at right now. Workforce is an issue all around. I think that's stabilizing at the big part of the industry side, though still a problem in the supply chain. I worry about what we're producing in that pipeline. If you look 10 years ahead, particularly in the engineering side, a lot of schools are now engineering and computer science. And while they look to be growing, if you look more closely, the computer science part is growing, not necessarily the engineering, many of the engineering aspects of it. So we have to keep our eye on all this because these are long-term ongoing struggles. But that workforce issue is also a problem on the FAA side. I think we have underinvested in the FAA for many years. That reauthorization is up this year. It's critically important. And my headline when I talk about the FAA is we need to make sure they have the right workforce in order to be the best partner they can with industry. And they need some systems updates, just like we were talking about DoD, and that requires investment. They're working on some old systems and are really doing the people they have, I think, are doing heroic jobs keeping that all together and working with that. And so we need to take a look and make sure that we are investing properly for the future to maintain that unbelievable level of safety that we have today in aviation.
Eric, thanks so very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Terrific conversation as always. And David, thanks again to you and your team for organizing this great conference. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.